Hey, I'm some nobody, and a popular opinion that I vehemently disagree with is the idea that Insomniac is the end-all be-all studio for superhero games. That opinion is a lot less popular now, but ever since Insomniac's first Spider-Man game, you saw people online clamoring for them to make every superhero game without even considering whether or not it'd actually be a good fit. It used to be a big pet peeve of mine when people used to say that Marvel's Avengers would have been so much better if it was made by Insomniac without having any real insight to explain why or how. I've talked about superhero games a fair amount on my channel, and one thing I always say is that ideally a superhero game should strive to capture the essence or the feeling of the character. I know that's an overused line by game reviewers, but to reuse a metaphor from my Avengers video, if I buy a Captain America game, I don't want the gameplay to be Kirby. So ever since it was announced, and to this day, I'm not at all excited for Insomniac's Wolverine game. Like, if we're going purely off of Sony Studios, I think Santa Monica would have been a much better fit for Wolverine because Santa Monica's specialty is that brutal, spectacular combat. Insomniac specializes in self-expression, giving players tons of tools to play with and letting them be creative in combat. Their claim to fame is Ratchet and Clank after all, and if you think about what makes Insomniac's Spider-Man different from the millions of other Spider-Man single-player games that have come out, it's that self-expression with the gadgets. Thing is, I don't really want to be creative playing as Wolverine, at least not in the way that Insomniac usually does it. I just want to snikt, bub, and be the best there is at what I do. And I really don't want to craft items as Wolverine. Now, with the philosophy explained, you read the title. I think The Punisher and Naughty Dog are an almost perfect fit. Some of you hear that and it immediately clicks into place for you, but to explain why I think that, I'm going to divide this video into 3 parts. First, I'm going to talk about the Punisher, my own personal thoughts on him, and how I believe he is best used. Then I'm basically going to review The Last of Us Part 2 as a way to talk about Naughty Dog's skills as a studio. And part 3 of the video is going to be me trying to bring those 2 points together. By my standards, that was a pretty concise intro, so let's get right to talking about the man that convinced Batman that the entire Marvel Universe is an absolute shithole.
The ones who killed my family, the Saints, and all the other scum. They've given me a reason to live. I'm back. And it's their turn to die.
We all know how Frank Castle becomes the Punisher. He serves in the military, is exceptionally good at killing folks, then comes back home and lives a normal life until him and his family are caught in the crossfire of gang violence during a picnic. A random case of wrong place and wrong time leads to Frank Castle declaring an endless war on all criminals and becoming a cold, calculating mass murderer that serves as judge, jury, and executioner for anybody he decides deserves to die. The Punisher is a complex character, the anti-hero that I would say defines the term because very few characters better embody the antithesis of the superhero without being a straight-up villain. The Punisher is not about uplifting the downtrodden or protecting the innocent. Most versions of the character will prioritize protecting the innocent over punishing the guilty if he can only do one or the other, but it's not his primary goal. The Punisher doesn't meticulously research and observe his targets to wait for the perfect moment to strike without putting innocent people in danger because he doesn't want to put innocent people in danger. He doesn't want to put innocent people in danger, but what he's really doing is curating his own battlefield. He needs innocent people out of the way so he can go all out on the guilty. The Punisher does not represent hope or kindness. He represents rage. I like Frank Castle. A lot of people do, but a lot of people are stupid. There's a good amount of people who support the idea of a vigilante taking to the streets and killing anybody they deem undesirable. What gives Frank Castle the right to decide who lives and who dies? The fact that bad shit happened to him? bad shit happened to Eddie Brock and the symbiote, does Venom have the right to kill Spider-Man? Now see, it's different because the Punisher kills bad guys. He kills his definition of bad guys, which luckily is usually a universally agreed upon definition. But it isn't always. What about that time in The Runaways he was willing to shoot a bunch of kids for stealing? Or that time in Anti-Venom when he seemed willing to shoot through a woman being used as a human shield just because the woman was addicted to drugs? What about the Lego Marvel Superheroes version of the Punisher that kills people for driving trucks that are bad for the environment? You could argue that the situation in Runaways shouldn't count because the author just really hated the Punisher and didn't fully understand the character. You could argue that the situation in Anti-Venom was just a bluff because he only says he's willing to do it instead of straight up doing it. You could argue against all these examples, but it doesn't change the question. What if the Punisher's definition of bad guy wasn't the same as yours? What if he converted to vegan and decided that meat was murder and so he blasts your ass for having a cheeseburger? Now that his beliefs don't exactly line up with yours, he's no longer exactly what this city needs. He's an armed and dangerous madman. You could make a very similar argument against all vigilantes technically, but there's a big difference between Frank and other vigilantes. Spider-Man shoots at someone, they get webbed up. Frank shoots at someone, they die. So even if you agree with Frank's actions, you should disagree with the concept of the Punisher on a fundamental level. Even if you don't disagree with Frank on a fundamental level, you need to recognize that his methods don't actually accomplish much. One of my all-time favorite Punisher stories is the Widowmaker arc of Punisher Max, and he spends most of that story handcuffed to a bed. Widowmaker as a whole is a story about just how empty Frank's endless war is, having one character fully walk the path Frank walks, and having another character narrowly avoid becoming Frank. But Widowmaker perfectly got the point across with the start of the second issue of the arc. Oh shit, hey Dan, put a content warning earlier in the video. This is my editor Dan, he's a pretty good dude. Frank shows up at a suburban home where a couple have been making CP with their own children in the basement. They believe Frank is some type of authority figure and he has them sit the kids on the couch, then takes the couple down to the basement where he kills both of them, lamenting that he doesn't have the time to let the parents suffer. Frank calls the police and sits with the kids until they show up so the kids don't go down to the basement and see what he did to their parents. And as Frank is leaving the house, he makes an observation that I think is the most chilling line in the character's history. The little girl couldn't have been more than 4. She might stand a chance, depending on how much of it stayed with her. Not being an expert, I couldn't say for sure. The boys looked like the damage was done. I had a sinking feeling I'd be seeing them again in 20 years. There are times I'd like to get my hands on God. The most obvious takeaway from this page is Frank's acknowledgement that he didn't truly help these kids. Now, there's only so much any vigilante could have done here. I'm not expecting Frank to go back in time and stop the abuse from ever happening. But it's like Frank said, despite the justice or punishment, whatever you want to call it, being served, the damage is already done. These kids are going to have to go through the system with this unresolved trauma and maybe everything will be okay. Or maybe they're going to resort to unhealthy ways to cope with that trauma. Maybe they turn to drugs. Maybe victim becomes victimizer. Maybe they just get plain angry. No matter what, the things they've gone through means they will live a rough life, and that rough life may lead them down a dark path. And when they walk down that dark path, the Punisher will be there to kill them for it. Not everybody who winds up hurting somebody else is a sadistic monster who was born wanting to hurt people. Some people are born evil, but most wind up hurting other people through compromised economic or mental health circumstances. That doesn't mean them hurting people is alright, but it does mean it's not as simple as killing the bad guy means nobody will get hurt anymore. Violence is often cyclical, and that plays into the less obvious takeaway of the page. Frank believes he'll still be doing this in 20 years. Now, unless you live in Utopia, there will always be some level of crime. And even if you live in Utopia, there will always be evil. But Frank has no end goal or grand vision for his war outside of it being endless. He's well aware that his way of doing things has no real positive impact in terms of actually stopping crime or keeping innocent people safe. He doesn't care about the futility of his war, he only cares that it won't end until he's dead. There is no hope for a better tomorrow in the Punisher's crusade. You can judge Batman for his no-kill rule all you want, but Batman's ultimate goal, the reason he does what he does, is to eventually reach a point where he doesn't need to anymore. Batman's fight is for a night in Gotham where a child doesn't lose a parent, where a parent doesn't lose a child, where nobody loses a brother or a friend or even a regular at their restaurant. Batman fights for a night without violence. The Punisher's fight means there will never be a night in New York without violence. Now all that being said, I know what you're thinking. Wow, this guy fucking hates the Punisher. Not at all. I like the Punisher, but I think you have to recognize that he's wrong in order to totally appreciate him as a character. I see the Punisher as the feeling you get in your chest when you read a news story about just how evil your fellow man is capable of being. Do me a favor, I want you to paint a picture in your head. Close your eyes and imagine you live in the Marvel Universe version of New York. I want you to imagine two people walking through Central Park late at night. They can be whoever you want them to be. They can be young, they can be old, they can be friends, family, a couple. They're out and about for whatever reason you want to come up with, and they come across a group of unsavory characters. These unsavory characters can also be whoever you want them to be. They can be gangsters, they can be Wall Street sociopaths, cultists, some type of phobe. Whatever kind of people that you think would give your two innocents trouble unprovoked. Before anything too bad can happen to your two innocents, Spider-Man or Daredevil or Luke Cage or the other Spider-Man shows up. The bad guys go to jail and your innocents get to go home safe. Pretty feel-good news story the next day, right? Spider-Man saves lives in Central Park. You don't watch the Bugle anymore, it's a little too negative for your liking. But hearing that they got home safe, that puts a smile on your face, gives you hope for your city, maybe even inspires you to be a better person. You don't need superpowers to look out for each other. Now picture the exact same scenario, only this time no heroes happen to be around. Despite how many of them live in New York City, it's the city that never sleeps and you can't possibly cover every inch of it. I want you to imagine the absolute worst news you could read or watch the next day. Picture something so horrible happening in Central Park that night that when you read about it the next day, it gets you breathing heavy. It gets you getting up and pacing around your house. A story so bad you think to yourself, oh, I wish I could get my fucking hands on those people. And that news story mentions that the police have captured all but one of your unsavory characters. And now I have to ask you, of all the vigilantes that are active in New York City, which one are you hoping gets him first? That feeling is the essence of the Punisher. I see the Punisher as an indulgence of wrath. It's a sort of junk food for the soul. I believe the character's at his absolute best when he represents that anger and that hatred that all human beings feel from time to time. It works great when Frank is acting as a foil to a more righteous vigilante like Daredevil or Spider-Man, characters who definitely feel that anger but refuse to let it compromise who they are. But it's just as good when Frank is the closest thing to a hero in the story. Punisher stories need you to absolutely despise the villain to such a degree that you'll root for Frank despite the issues with his philosophy. They need to push you to feel that same wrath you just felt when those unsavory characters did what they did to your innocence, so you'll go against the better way. I think the acknowledgement that Frank is a monster, but not the worst one out there, is what carries his character. That's why John Bernthal's Punisher, when he's in a Daredevil show, is legitimately amazing, but his own show kinda sucked. In Daredevil, Frank gets to be a true anti-hero because the story already has a hero. In the Punisher show, they made Frank a reluctant killer who gets dragged into conflicts rather than actively seeking them out in an attempt to make him more likable, sanitizing the character to make him more easily digestible while completely misunderstanding that the Punisher is supposed to be a bit unlikable. Now I know it may seem like I've been on a soapbox this whole video so far, but let me be clear, I am not above enjoying the Punisher brutalizing rapists and murderers. I know I called it junk food for the soul, but you can only have so much chicken soup for the soul before you eventually say, now I need something sweet. And in that regard, the Punisher TV show is like having an orange for dessert. Now I love oranges. You give me one, I'll snatch it away, scurry off, crouch in the nearest corner, and absolutely devour it. But if you're doing dessert, you want something bad for you. You want tawas, you want cannoli, you want lukmatokari. You want to see the Punisher go after a real piece of shit like Barracuda. Kuda's an entertaining character, no doubt about it, but he is potentially one of the worst human beings of all times. He's a character that's so evil yet charismatic that you love to hate him and you can't wait for Frank to get his hands on him. Barracuda is such a perfect villain for the Punisher that he's one of the few that gets to survive an encounter with Frank and come back for another round. Because you want him dead so bad that you'll read his spin-off and clamor for him to return just so Frank can fuck him up more than once. That moment where Frank finally blows Barracuda's head off after Kuda's life and all his crimes flash before his eyes is like chocolate cake, and just like chocolate cake, you should be disgusted with yourself. I think there should be moments where you disconnect with Frank even though you want to see him succeed. Moments where Frank pushes past what you're comfortable with to remind you that no matter how angry and wrathful you may be, you aren't coming close to the amount of hatred in Frank's heart. In the penultimate issue of the Slaver's arc in Punisher Max, Frank finally manages to corner Vera Constantine, a woman who helps run a sex trafficking ring and who deserves punishment more than most and just as much as the men she collaborated with. Vera coined the phrase, "rape them to break them." She believed that breaking the women they took as soon as possible was vital to controlling them. She said they needed to understand just how powerless they were, so Frank uses her own logic against her. This is definitely one of the Punisher's most iconic kills for the catharsis of the brutality, but also for the irony of it. We want to see Frank get this lady the same way we want to see Frank get the rest of them because of what they've done. We're so disgusted by the violence against women that we wind up rooting for the massive dude throwing a woman headfirst into a window over and over. Vera has it coming, absolutely deserves it, but that doesn't change what the scene is. Removed from context, it's a horrifying couple of pages, and somebody who's squeamish to violence against women would probably find it hard to go through even with context. What I'm getting at is that the Punisher is a level of merciless that some people can't handle. I would like to see an adaptation of Punisher, whether it be a movie, TV show, or video game, that feels like the ending to the original The Hills Have Eyes, where Doug displays a level of brutality equal to the savages that attacked his family and is horrified by it. Except instead of the character being horrified by it, we should be horrified and Frank should be unbothered. That's pretty much everything I've got to say about the Punisher. Frank doesn't have to be this way in every appearance ever to be a good take, but in my opinion, this is the Punisher at his best. In solo stories at least. I don't want him beating a woman to death in Spider-Man Brand New Day. But I would like it if there was a scene where he kills a dude right in front of Spider-Man so Peter beats the dog shit out of him without saying a single word. We've seen plenty of angry Spider-Man in live action, but I think Frank would be the perfect character to get our first mask-on, fully silent Spider-Man beatdown. Anyway, somebody who's very familiar with The Last of Us 2 but wasn't too familiar with Frank may already see the vision, but now I'm going to move to talking about the other half of the equation, Naughty Dog. I have played 2 Naughty Dog games, not counting the Crash Bandicoot games because the studio has been Ship of Theseus since then. I played Uncharted 4 because it came with my PS4 and I thought it was pretty good. Then this year I played The Last of Us 2 for this video. Now that may raise some questions. Some nobody, how could you come to believe Naughty Dog could make a good Punisher game with such limited experience with their games? Simple. I am a day one Last of Us hater, and a real hater educates themselves. I have no actual issues with the games themselves. They're fine, and I'd go as far to say they're good. All of my problems with The Last of Us are due to external factors. See, I was pretty immature and ignorant 13 years ago. I saw The Last of Us 1 released less than a year after Telltale's The Walking Dead, and I said, they stole Lee and Clementine's whole flow, bar for bar, man, fuck The Last of Us. Then The Last of Us became one of the most acclaimed video games of all time, and still being immature but less ignorant by that point, I hated on it because it was popular. But in my defense, the dick eating was crazy. Remember when IGN said The Last of Us was the 17th best video game of all time, better than Portal, Resident Evil 4, Snake Eater, and Minecraft? That whole list is fucked actually. They said Fortnite was better than Resident Evil 2 Remake. They said Fortnite is one of the top 100 games of all time. I got this theory. For whatever reason, video games got really popular around the end of the 7th gen, start of the 8th generation of consoles. Popular in the sense that more people started playing games that weren't mainstream, games beyond the yearly AAA releases. Yakuza and Persona both went from being super niche series in the West to being extremely popular because both series put out a really good installment during this boom period. And a game that came out right at the start of this boom period, and maybe even started the boom period, was The Last of Us. It's entirely possible that The Last of Us was a lot of people's gateway into trying more games outside their comfort zone and experiencing that there are actually a lot of really good video games out there. Think about it, if the only single-player games you had ever played were Assassin's Creed and Grand Theft Auto, The Last of Us would be an absolute life-changer. But if you'd already played a game like Half-Life 2, Red Dead Redemption, Yakuza 4, you'd already know that video games could be peak, so The Last of Us would just be a pretty good game. So when a lot of people were proudly proclaiming that The Last of Us was the best game ever, better than everything else, it irked a lot of people. It's kind of like the white kid that's only ever listened to M&Ms saying Eminem is the greatest rapper of all time. So yeah, back in the day I was a Last of Us hater because I thought it was overrated. These days I don't give a shit about people liking or disliking things. The reason I'm not a big fan of The Last of Us to this day is how Sony's decided to homogenize their exclusives to be more like The Last of Us. Most obvious example of this is the newer God of War games, making Kratos a dad that goes on a cinematic journey with his kid and having their dynamic be the real core of the story. It is quite literally the God of War of us. But as a whole, ever since The Last of Us released, the identity of PlayStation's big exclusives has become these cinematic games where you usually crouch walk through tall grass. The Horizon series, Days Gone, the Ghost of Japan series, Death Stranding, to an extent the Final Fantasy VII Remake, that's kind of cinematic. I'm not speaking on the quality of any of these games. I think most of them are pretty good as a matter of fact. I'm just saying, it seems like if you want to make a big budget game for PlayStation, you better have some Last of Us DNA in there. Even Spider-Man has segments where you have to do Last of Us gameplay. Now I had to rant for a bit there because 99% of what I'm about to say about The Last of Us 2 is going to be positive, and I don't want to risk losing my license to hate. It was a really good game. Great, as a matter of fact. I'd say I thoroughly enjoyed it once I got past the out-of-place open world segment that kicks off Ellie's first day in Seattle. I'm not usually a fan of stealth games, but I really enjoyed how natural it felt in Last of Us 2. Admittedly, infected segments kinda felt like the stealth games I'm not a fan of. Crouch walking up behind brain-dead enemies that are staring at walls for no reason and taking them down slowly is not really my style. But luckily you control the buttons you press in this game, and loud infected encounters are pretty fun. Having to bob, weave, and kite the runners while avoiding the instant killers in the infected rosters, it's a pretty good time. But the human encounters are the real treasure of The Last of Us 2, and each one of them is an absolute blast. There isn't a stealth state and an alarmed state like a lot of games that have stealth mechanics but aren't fully stealth games. The second an enemy can't see you anymore, you can slip back into playing stealthily, which pairs perfectly with the level design of Last of Us 2. The sprawling encounter arenas are filled with cracks to slip through, windows to jump through, ledges to climb and drop down, and things to crawl under. It's extremely hard to find yourself cornered in The Last of Us 2. There's always somewhere you can scramble to, and as a matter of fact, one of the worst things you can do is try and hold a position and play like a cover-based third-person shooter. I'm not worried about the enemy AI breaking free and taking over the world, but they're not stupid. If enemies know where you are, they will flank you, rush your position, and clip you if you pop out of cover after they do. I had to unlearn quite a few habits from other games for this one. Sometimes you can just outgun human encounters, but they're very competent. Add on the fact that the aiming and shooting on the PlayStation version is very heavy, and it's clear you aren't meant to Gears of War through these encounters. Instead, you want to always be on the move in The Last of Us 2, be unpredictable, and never give enemies a chance to make a plan. More than any game I've ever played, The Last of Us 2's gameplay loop is very reminiscent of guerrilla warfare. And I don't mean you're doing what the United States did back in 2004 when they deployed apes to Afghanistan. I mean you're planning ambushes and utilizing hit-and-run tactics to take down a much larger and more organized group. There are times where I throw a Molotov at a group walking together, set a trap where I threw the Molotov from, then be army crawling my way over to the other side of the arena when I'd hear the boom. Sometimes I would blast one or two guys, then run away and slip through a narrow gap and pop back up to blast whoever followed me through the gap as they're shuffling through defenseless. Sometimes I'd pop an enemy's head from a distance with the hunting pistol or the hunting rifle, then start circling around to catch the enemy that's coming to investigate where the shot came from. I remember this specific encounter, the one outside the hospital, where the enemies chased me into this room with a window, so I climbed out the window, circled around, and opened fire on them with the shotgun as they were going to investigate the room I ran into. The gameplay is really all about misdirection, and on rare occasions you can actually perform false flag operations to pit two factions against each other. There are a few encounters that feature both infected and human enemies, and you can use your throwables and tools to alarm the infected and hinder the humans as they try to fight them off, then come in and finish off whatever's left. You can also somewhat sadistically feed humans to the infected if you grab a human enemy as a shield. In the name of evening the odds, you can even commit war crimes. One of my favorite things about the game's combat is once it's over and quiet fills the air. It creates an eerie atmosphere where you can't hear or see any danger, but the stench of death is so heavy you aren't quite sure if you're safe. And you pause for a moment waiting for any late arrivals to the party. Unfortunately, the characters usually have a voice line that plays once all the enemies in an area are dead. All in all, it's a really fun game, and that's a pretty important factor because it's also a really violent game. The gameplay being so fun plays into one of its big themes, that being how easy it is to dehumanize your opposition, to see them as nothing more than the enemy. But it also helps offset the fact that when enemies die in The Last of Us 2, they really die. You hit a guy with a pipe bomb, you're not going to see his model cartoonishly ragdoll into the air. You're going to find him missing everything below his chest, with his intestines and other assorted organs hanging out of the bottom. Land a headshot and you're not going to get a splotch of blood texture on the side of their head. You're going to see brain matter splatter against the wall. Stealth kill an enemy with a shiv or Ellie's pocket knife and you're going to see every agonizing second on their face. Set an enemy on fire and you're going to hear them scream the entire time. There was a moment in the first encounter that introduces dogs where I went to chop up a dog with my melee weapon and I noticed it do a super realistic look around terrified with its ears back. The game is, in the words of the good doctor, savage as fuck. Anybody who gets that reference is getting a hard on their comment. With the intense gore, realistic death animations, and enemies yelling out in despair when you kill their friends, it's clear that The Last of Us 2 wants you to feel bad for playing it. And again, the gameplay being fun helps to balance that out. After all, who wants to play a game that isn't fun and makes you feel bad? A lot of people realize that the game wants you to feel bad for playing it and immediately get defensive. Dude, it's not like I had a choice, I had to kill them to progress the game. And when people were saying that about Spec Ops The Line back in the day, I would hit them with this fucking SpongeBob face because they fell right into the author's trap by saying that. But the statement doesn't really apply to The Last of Us 2 because the game isn't trying to shame you for playing it like Spec Ops The Line. The line in the name refers to the lines Walker, and by extension you, are willing to cross. you are meant to personally identify with Walker. The Last of Us 2 does not want you to personally identify with either of the playable characters. It actually wants you to do the exact opposite, disconnect from them. It wants you to completely understand both of them and not fully support either. That's why you spend half the game as Ellie, then half the game as Abby, then finish with Ellie again. The first half of the game you are meant to vibe with Ellie. You're meant to want Joel's killers dead just as much as she does. To an extent, you're meant to enjoy the carnage. Fuck these wolves. They're all bad guys getting in the way of justice being served. They deserve what you're doing to them. Over the course of Ellie's 3 days in Seattle, she engages in worse and worse violence each day, ultimately culminating in gut-shotting Abby's situationship and sticking a knife in a pregnant woman's throat. But even before that happens, there are moments in Ellie's 3-day rampage that are meant to make you raise an eyebrow. Like after she finds out her girlfriend is pregnant, and instead of immediately trying to get her back to safety, Ellie decides to stick around and make Dina wait while she gets her revenge. Or like when Ellie tortures one of Abby's friends to death to try and get her location. Or like when Ellie decides to keep chasing Abby instead of going with Jesse to try and save Tommy. Ellie and Abby both have moments like this, where they're offered a choice and they choose hate. So yeah, you're meant to gradually start thinking, wow, Ellie's a little fucked up, but can't blame her, they killed her father figure. Then you switch to Abby and you find out that Joel killed her dad, so if Ellie beating somebody to death with a pipe is okay because that person's friend killed Joel, then Abby beating Joel to death with a golf club for killing her dad is okay too. And Ellie is actually the unreasonable one. But actually, Joel only killed Abby's dad because her dad was gonna kill Joel's daughter figure for a cure that wasn't guaranteed, so Abby should just say, oh well, that's fair enough. A lot of the low-level haters harp on the logistics of the cure to try and explain why Abby's motivations are stupid or how Joel was in the right. But Abby doesn't give a fuck about the vaccine. She killed Joel because Joel killed her dad. And if you say Abby's stupid for wanting to avenge her dad, then you have to say Ellie's just as stupid for wanting to avenge her dad, and then you accidentally got the point of the game. It's a complex situation with no right answers, where everybody and their mother is obsessed with trying to say one side was right or wrong. It's just a suboptimal hater route. Point is, both sides in Last of Us 2 think they're in the right by seeking revenge. Abby in particular reminds me of a specific line from No More Heroes 2. If you aren't familiar, No More Heroes 2's story is very similar to Last of Us 2's. The child of a random character Travis killed in the first game gets revenge by killing Travis's best friend. This causes Travis to go back to fighting and killing his way through the assassin rankings, despite forsaking the entire concept after the first game in the name of revenge. It's only once Travis gets near the end of his quest does he fully understand just how many people he's killed that did nothing to him, all for the sake of getting back at the guy who got back at him. There's one boss in particular, Margaret Moonlight, whose boss fight theme, Philistine, is essentially a Travis touchdown diss track where she tears into him for being an otaku and calls him out on his hypocrisy. And Abby's perspective of Joel's murder actually reminded me of this specific line from that song. Objectively speaking, Abby and her friends should have killed Ellie and Tommy. A lot of things would have turned out better for them if they had. But they stupidly let them live because making the smartest move in that situation would have meant admitting that they aren't the good guys serving justice. Killing two people who have done nothing to them would make Abby and her gang cold-blooded murderers. The fact that they're getting payback on Joel means beating his brains in with a golf club while his loved ones watch, scream, cry, and beg for it to stop is actually a noble act. Ironically, Abby's segment starts with us vibing with her. She's still fully engrossed in the eye for an eye mindset, just like the audience. Ellie may have lost the way a little bit in her 3 days in Seattle, but there's never really a turnaround in her segment where we don't want revenge with her. And Abby feels the same way, yet following through and getting her revenge doesn't bring her peace. The loss of her father still haunts her. Most of Abby's segment has almost nothing to do with the opening on papers, instead focusing on a somewhat similar conflict between the two factions in Seattle, the WLF and the Seraphites. The effect the opening has on Abby's segment isn't a direct one, instead it just impacts how Abby and her friends feel about this long-standing conflict they've been a part of. Abby's perspective on the conflict at first is reflective of her views on the Joel conflict. The wolves are the good guys and the scars are the bad guys, despite the WLF being the ones that broke the most recent truce by shooting some Seraphite children. Abby is still indignant over the scars striking back. Her side is the right side, so any equal reaction from the other side is unfounded. Those Scar kids probably deserved it. It's that big theme of dehumanizing the enemy cropping up again. Abby's friends Mel and Owen both start having doubts about the conflict with the Seraphites after getting revenge on Joel. Mel was repulsed by the brutality of revenge on display with Joel, and Owen starts to see the pointlessness of it. Abby herself starts to doubt the cause after having her life saved by, and then saving two Seraphite kids named Yara and Lev. Having a nightmare about something other than her father for once. The idea of letting those kids die all because of a conflict she and them didn't start doesn't sit right with Abby anymore. After finally getting her revenge on Joel and getting no relief from it, the death of the enemy no longer brings Abby any joy. She can no longer muster up the hoorah to arbitrarily hate the Scars and take pleasure in killing them. Abby's second day is all about her starting to see the enemy as human and seeing the flaws in the side she fights for. Going to such great lengths to save an enemy child and fighting a Resident Evil boss fight after being arrested by her own side makes Abby start to realize that violence breeds violence. In the end, the wolves and the Scars are both the same. They even both have stupid-ass little ritual sayings for when they say goodbye, and Abby finally chooses a path other than violence for the sake of violence. She chooses compassion, and for the first time in a long time, she's able to dream of her father in a positive light. So after Abby's first 2 days being all about her growing as a person and learning the value of letting things go, Abby's day 3 is all about the consequences of not letting things go. I'd say Abby's day 3 is the best day in the entire game, and it has one of the best sequences of the game where the prologue finally comes back to haunt Abby, almost literally. Tommy emerges like a ghost to remind Abby that she's somebody else's main villain and puts something to think about in Manny's head. And of Abby's 3 friends that got screen time, Manny was probably my favorite, even though there wasn't much to him. And I have to admit something, I was fully spooked in the restaurant segment after Manny gets his head blown off, where you see Tommy moving at like Mach 7 in listen mode and then he just disappears. I was really expecting it to be a stealth versus stealth segment, but nah, you just walk out the door. Then you go to Scar Island to chase Lev, and I have to say, Scar Island as a whole, from a gameplay perspective, kicks ass. Scar Island is also where Lev loses his sister and his mother because he couldn't let things go. And Abby hits the peak of her character development when she betrays the WLF in favor of protecting Lev, fully breaking free from that eye for an eye mindset that led her to track down and kill Joel in the first place. And the WLF ultimately wind up almost completely wiped out because they went after the Scars on their own island, somewhat representative of both our main characters who crossed great distances for revenge just to lose everything. The escape from the Seraphite Island is probably one of my favorite stretches in the entire game. You're caught in a full-on war between two sides that both want you dead. It's nothing but horrific smaller conflicts making up one bigger conflict. The brawl at the end is deliciously gruesome and violent, but it's only one of hundreds going on at the same time as the two people who have moved beyond the conflict manage to escape. Then the consequences of killing Joel rear their ugly head when Abby finds Mel and Owen slaughtered by Ellie. You knew it was coming the whole time, but that makes the moment better in my opinion. You understand why they did what they did to Joel. You see how doing it affects them. You see how they grow afterwards, and in the back of your head, you know the whole time it doesn't matter because they're both going to die violently. It's a classic case of dying right after you finish your character development and right before you're about to get your happily ever after. Me personally, I wasn't broken up about it. Owen was kinda meh, and I'll come back to Mel later, but by that point I did like Abby enough to feel bad for her even though it's what she sowed. So Abby seeks revenge and winds up bringing Ellie, Dina, and Tommy the consequences for their seeking revenge by killing their favorite guy. Jesse's death is pretty interesting if you think about it from the perspective that the game has been asking you to think about everything. That perspective being perspective. If you think about it, Jesse is the exact same as all of Abby's friends. He's not directly responsible for killing anybody that Abby cares about, but he's still killed for the crime of wanting to support his friends. There really is no difference between Jesse and Nora outside of the fact that you met Jesse first and he got more screen time. If you think Nora got what was coming to her, you have to admit Jesse got what was coming to him too. Anyway, Abby's got this line that's kind of a regression to her day one self. We let you both live and you wasted it. The same way she was indignant that the Seraphites would dare strike back at the WLF, she's offended that Ellie and Tommy did the exact same thing her and her friends did. The fact that they didn't just throw their hands up and say, well, what are you gonna do, after their brother and father figure was viciously murdered in front of them is inconceivable. Back to that idea of both sides thinking everything they do is the right thing and everything the other side does is the wrong thing. The fight in the theater is a pretty cool and fun segment so long as Ellie doesn't decide to walk you down with her shotgun the moment the cutscene ends. But after Abby beats the absolute dog piss out of Ellie, she is given a choice. Violence for the sake of violence, killing a pregnant woman out of spite, sinking to the lows that your enemies sunk to, or compassion and mercy. Abby almost chooses the first option, but luckily Lev is there to remind her that she just went through 3 days of character development. So Abby lets Ellie, Dina, and incidentally Tommy walk away. So to summarize Seattle, Ellie got worse, Abby got better. But the consequences train for not letting things go keeps rolling. Abby and Lev get taken as slaves because she goes looking for something she lost a long time ago instead of just moving on. Tommy winds up losing his wife because despite the fact he was nearly killed and is now crippled because of revenge, he won't let the Abby thing go. And Ellie is once again given a choice between choosing hate or choosing love. She is given the choice between staying with Dina and the ugly-ass baby on their farm or chasing after Abby one more time because it went so well for her the first time. I want to end the review section of this video on a positive note when I talk about the ending, so right here I'm going to talk about my big issues with The Last of Us 2. And those issues are weirdly enough the game's two pregnant women, Dina and Mel. Ellie and Dina's relationship confused me a bit at first because it felt really rushed. Dina breaks up with her boyfriend, then a week later she kisses Ellie, the next day they fuck, then the next day Dina's willing to go across the country on a revenge quest that she refuses to let Ellie do alone. And they're talking about how much they love each other and all that stuff, and I'm thinking you guys have been together 3 weeks. I understand that they've liked each other for a long time. If you read Ellie's journal and the flashback segments, it's clear she's been in love with Dina for a long time. But I'm still sitting here thinking, why wouldn't you just write them to be together since before the start of the game? Why are we speed running this? And then I realize, oh, we're rushing this because we need Dina to be pregnant for the purpose of drama. And it feels kinda lazy, but lazy in the way where you did more work to work around something instead of just doing it the right way. I don't dislike Dina as a character, but to me it feels like they wanted to write a queer relationship but only knew heterosexual cliches. Like they wanted to use Dina's pregnancy as a plot device and a drama amplifier, but they realized Ellie can't get her pregnant, so they had to come up with Jesse and rush together their romance. And it also feels like they could only come up with a very typically heterosexual happy ending for Ellie and Dina that Ellie can walk away from. It dragged down Ellie and Dina's entire romance in my eyes because, like I said, it feels like a workaround. The type of workaround your dad does before your mom calls in a real plumber and the real plumber comes in and says, oh, whoever did this for you guys fucked you up. There is the idea that it's meant to create a parallel with Mel on the other side, so when Ellie kills her, it's especially bad, but I'm not a big fan of Mel either. Mel feels like she's not a complete character, like she exists somewhat arbitrarily to create a love triangle with Abby and Owen. She has almost no chemistry with her baby daddy Owen and feels like she really only exists to beef with Abby, and it's not a very compelling beef if I'm being honest. It's really not clear why Owen is even with Mel because it seems like he doesn't give a shit about her, but the game makes it clear him and Abby have liked each other their entire lives. And then Mel's pregnancy is really just a dramatic amplifier to make Ellie killing her extra bad. I suppose you can chalk a lot of those issues up to Abby's friends not getting a lot of screen time in favor of focusing on Abby and Lev, and I do like Abby and Lev, so maybe it was a worthwhile sacrifice. Anyway, time to talk about the game's ending. So of course, Ellie once more chooses hatred over love and heads to Santa Barbara looking for Abby. She also incidentally brings down the Santa Barbara slave trade. The Rattlers aren't in the game very long, but I do appreciate the game giving us an undisputably despicable faction of enemies. Just like the first time she tried this whole revenge thing, Ellie gets the shit kicked out of her on her way to find Abby. She gets hung upside down for hours, stabbed deep in her side by a tree, and bitten, though that doesn't mean much to her. But she does eventually find Abby, and Abby is barely recognizable. Not being able to let things go has led to Abby losing everything. Her home, her cause, her friends, her hair, her muscles. But interestingly enough, Abby is rewarded for being the only character in the story that ever chooses compassion and mercy over violence and hatred. Because if Abby hadn't spared Ellie and Dina in the theater all that time ago, she would have lost her life and Lev too. And at this point, Ellie is given that same choice one more time. And despite losing something every time she's ever made this decision, she can't help herself but to choose violence and hatred one more time. Going as far as threatening to slit a kid's throat to force Abby into violence too. I kinda see it as a reflection of Abby's mindset when she was killing Joel, where she lets Ellie and Tommy live because doing otherwise would mean admitting she's not in the right. If killing Abby was all Ellie truly wanted, she could've just came up behind her and shanked her or slit her throat the same way she did a bunch of other enemies throughout the game. But Ellie can't do that to this version of Abby that's broken beyond recognition and wants to just move on and live in peace. Ellie needs Abby to fight back to believe that she's still the evil bitch from the ski lodge. In short, Ellie is beat to shit. She's exhausted, she's traveled many miles to be here, given up her happy ending, and her hate boner is having some performance issues. I can definitely understand why some people were upset with Ellie letting Abby live in the end, but it made perfect sense to me. Because at this point, Abby is Joel. She is a person that has done many morally questionable things in her life, but has since formed connections that caused her to change and grow as a person. If you wanted Ellie to kill Abby at the end, then logically speaking, you have to agree with Abby's decision to beat Joel's brains in with a golf club. So in my eyes, despite all the bad Ellie has done over the course of the game, it makes sense to me that she wouldn't be able to bring herself to kill somebody else's Joel. And I like that the game kinda has a downer ending where Ellie faces and accepts the consequences of her choices. It's ultimately Ellie's fault that she lost Dina, the ugly-ass contrived existence baby, and the ability to play Joel's song, that last connection she had to him. A guy like me put me in this same situation. I'm going back to Jackson and I'm just lying and telling Tommy I got her. Fuck you gonna do, go check? All in all, I really enjoyed The Last of Us 2, and I especially appreciate how brutal and divisive the game is. It seems like in the last couple of years, a lot of media, whether that be video games, TV shows, or movies, is absolutely terrified of making their audience feel any negative emotion whatsoever. Like the audience can't handle complex characters and narratives that'll make them feel any feeling other than entertained. And to be fair, some people can't. Some people don't want any media to make them feel uncomfortable or scared or angry or sad. They only want to be entertained. I made a video about Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, and my biggest flaw with that game is this exact issue, that it had an extremely risky and emotional concept, but it didn't want the audience to feel anything. Season 2 of The Last of Us TV show has actually been torn apart because they sanitized a lot of the grittiest and most brutal moments in the game. I actually have a new theory that the reason I don't like Spider-Man 2 is because of The Last of Us 2. I think it's entirely possible Sony saw how people reacted to risky narratives and complex characters who do bad shit, and they said, oh fuck, we need to clean up Spider-Man 2 crazy. Because Spider-Man 2 doesn't take any risks, and it really feels like they go out of their way to make sure nobody could ever feel a negative emotion while playing it. So yeah, I appreciate Naughty Dog being willing and being allowed to take the kind of risks they did with Last of Us 2. Especially because I want them to take even greater risks. Speaking of...
You give them back shots and they get back up. I give them back shots today. Stay down. It's permanent. I take pride in that.
So I talked about the Punisher, the brutality of the character, the risks I think you have to take with him, and how you're meant to feel about him. And I talked about The Last of Us 2, the brutality and fun factor of the gameplay, the interesting nature of the perspectives, and its attempts to make you disconnect with its two-player characters. Now obviously from a gameplay perspective, a lot of what works in The Last of Us 2 would be fantastic for a Punisher game. Namely, the guerrilla tactics I mentioned earlier, the melee combat, the ability to take people as shields, turning urban environments into battlegrounds. Though admittedly, Naughty Dog wouldn't have the benefit of everything being bombed to shit to explain why it fits good video game level design, but setting traps and executing ambushes are definitely in Frank's wheelhouse. Maybe instead of crafting landmines out of cans of soda, Frank could put wire up in doorways that'll trip or maybe even kill enemies that are running, but if an enemy walks into it, nothing's going to happen to them. So you put it up in the doorway, then start shooting out the window of a room. If somebody runs in to try and catch you by surprise, they get caught by the wire. There is also the element of scavenging and crafting mid-mission not really being Frank's style. He usually shows up with everything he needs. I could definitely picture Frank improvising explosives and raiding a medicine cabinet mid-gunfight. But he's definitely not scrounging around for loose bullets. Since bullets and fully automatic weapons would be somewhat plentiful in this hypothetical Punisher game, it may wind up being a bit more like Uncharted than The Last of Us. I don't think that'd be an issue though, because while Frank is known to use misdirection, traps, and ambushes, he's just as likely to overwhelm his targets with superior equipment. But I suppose Frank has to get the equipment from somewhere, so maybe Naughty Dog could take a page out of Volition's Punisher game's book and have Frank steal equipment from the criminals he's killing. That game lets you choose what weapons from Frank's armor you can start each level with. I also think it'd be cool if they brought in these special kills and interrogation scenes from that game, because Naughty Dog already has that punch laser technology that lets you use the environment in melee combat. Not saying bring back the interrogation minigame, because I don't think that fits the tone that I would want for the game, but imagine kicking an enemy into a drill press, then following up by driving it through their skull. That Punisher game actually has a lot of gnarly environmental kills in it that would probably be absolutely sickening with the modern graphics and realistic gore that Naughty Dog has provided. Like Frank throwing this guy into a car compactor looks a little silly on account of it looking like a 3D Mortal Kombat stage kill, but if you think about the actual event that is going on here, it's pretty fucked up. That Punisher game actually lets you dismember enemies with your guns, throw bottles at them, and has enemies call out their friends' names after Frank kills them, just like in Last of Us 2, so I think Naughty Dog owes some royalties. In all seriousness though, Volition's Punisher game does have an impressive level of brutality for the time, and even though it's very arcadey, I do think Naughty Dog should take inspiration from it for this hypothetical Punisher game. The specifics of the gameplay don't exactly matter for a game that will probably never exist. So much of The Last of Us 2's gameplay fitting the Punisher already does make me think that Naughty Dog could do a very good job designing a gameplay loop that feels like the Punisher. But I'm sure a lot of studios could. The fact that the gameplay would be fun is not the main reason I'm picking Naughty Dog to develop a Punisher game. I choose Naughty Dog because I think they'd tackle some of those more challenging aspects of the character that I mentioned earlier. Because the challenges are somewhat similar to what Neil Druckmann said the mission statement of Last of Us 2 was back in 2020. Neil said in an interview with IGN, "Can we make you hate someone to such a degree that you want to hurt them in really horrible ways for what they've done to you, then all of a sudden make you play as them?" And the challenge was, can we get you to empathize? I said it earlier, The Last of Us 2 does not want you to pick one side or the other. It wants you to understand both. You understand why Ellie is on her revenge quest, but you don't believe it justifies the things she does. You understand Abby seeking redemption and growth, but you don't think she really deserves it. During the final fight, I knew Ellie was going to win beforehand because it's all anybody's ever talked about, but even during the fight, I didn't exactly want either one of them to win. By that point, I was pretty disconnected from both of them. So I think the question for a Punisher game is, can we make you hate someone to such a degree that you want to hurt them in really horrible ways for what they've done, but then make you feel bad when those people are hurt in really horrible ways? It's that tightrope you have to walk whenever you use the character. How do you make people disagree with him but want him to succeed? How do you get across to the audience that the character they're rooting for is just the lesser of two evils? And I'm not talking like a side-eye type of acknowledgement. I'm talking about full-on, I want the player to be afraid of the Punisher even though they control him. Anytime they lose control of him for like a cutscene or something, I want the player holding their breath. Take the violence that's meant to disconnect you from Ellie and her segment of The Last of Us 2 and amp that up. Do whatever you gotta do to get that effect where you have the player sitting there slack-jawed, horrified at what happened after they pressed a button. Can you make your players want extreme violence and then when they get it, make them not want it anymore? I really don't know how you would do it, but I think Naughty Dog could make a damn fine attempt. But that's pretty much all I got to say. I have no idea how to end this video, so I'm just going to say thanks for listening to me talk. I hope you agree that Naughty Dog should make a Punisher game, and and RGG Studios should make a JoJo Part 4 game.